Okay, great. I think we have enough people to go ahead and get started. So welcome everybody to this event. Thank you very much for being here. My name is Jeff Sebo, and I direct the NYU Mind Ethics and Policy program, which is the main host of this talk. And we are thrilled to have Bob Fischer here to present some of his research and really collaborative research based on the Moral Weight Project about how to do interspecies welfare comparisons in a responsible way. So let me start by saying a little bit about our program and programs, and then I can explain how this session will go and introduce our speaker, and we can get started with the talk. So as I said, this talk is being hosted by the NYU Mind Ethics and Policy program. This program launched in fall 22, and it exists to conduct and support research and outreach about the consciousness and sentience and sapience and moral and legal and political status of non-humans, including animals and artificial intelligences. So we want to conduct and support research about what different non-human cognitive systems are like and whether they can experience pleasure and pain and happiness and suffering and other morally significant states. And we also want to think about the kinds of moral and legal and political consideration that non-human minds might merit. And Bob is going to talk about a very relevant topic, so we are excited for that. In addition to having the Mind Ethics and Policy program, we recently launched the NYU Wild Animal Welfare Program, which examines what wild animals are like and how humans and wild animals interact and how we can improve our interactions with wild animals at scale. Some of you might be interested in that. We also continue to have our Animal Studies MA program, which likewise examines what animals are like and how humans and other animals interact, and the moral and social and legal and political and economic and ecological significance of animals and our interactions. So if you have interest in any of that in our academic programs or in our research or outreach programs, please feel free to let me know, or please feel free to go to our website and sign up for our email list. I also want to recognize that this talk is being co-sponsored by the NYU Center for Bioethics. So thank you very much to our partners in bioethics for promoting this talk and being here with us. And with all of that said, the way that the talk will go today is we are planning to go for approximately 75 minutes, and Bob is going to speak for very roughly 40 of those 75 minutes, give or take. And in the meantime, you can all be entering questions and comments in the Q&A tab of the Zoom webinar. And when we reach the point of having a discussion, I will then present some of your questions and comments to Bob for discussion. And so you can both enter questions and comments and then upvote them, and then I can relay them to the speaker. So hopefully all of that is clear. Without further ado, I can introduce our speaker and we can get started. So this talk is going to be about why interspecies welfare comparisons are both important and difficult to make. And our speaker is Bob Fischer, who is an associate professor of philosophy at Texas State University, a senior research manager at Rethink Priorities, and the director of the Society for the Study of Ethics in Animals. His most recent books are Animal Ethics, A Contemporary Introduction, published by Routledge in 2021, and Weighing Animal Welfare, Comparing Well-Being Across Species, which is forthcoming from Oxford University Press. So Bob, thanks so much for being here and really looking forward to hearing your talk.
Thanks so much for having me, Jeff. Thank you for organizing. Thank you, Sophia, as well for organizing. Let me make sure that my screen has shared. Is everybody seeing that just fine? I'm going to assume so. Excellent. Marvelous. Okay. So, we went too quickly there. Well, all right. Thanks a bunch for being here. Thanks for making the time out of your day to have this conversation, to chat about some of these issues, to think about them with me. What we're going to do today is I'm going to run through a range of arguments and issues that are relevant to the task of making interspecies welfare comparisons, which are going to be, they're relevant in a whole bunch of contexts. Some of them are large macro level, policy level questions. You know, what kinds of trade-offs should we accept between animal welfare and environmental goods when we are trying to figure out how to produce sustainable food systems? Some of them are, relatively micro level choices that people face when they're trying to decide how to take care of their companion animals. Like, what trade-offs should they accept between the welfare of their cat and the welfare of the wild animals who might be harmed by those cats if they're allowed to free roam. And then, there are these kinds of questions, which are, trade-offs that emerge in the context of, particular policy choices that have been implemented, say, in an animal research context. So this is an example. It's due to a colleague of mine, Adam Schreiber. He was pointing out that, the 3 R's, which govern the practice of scientific research on animals, recommend reducing harms, replacing animals with non-animal models, and refining methods so that they cause as little harm as possible. And those have been interpreted such that they are encouraging folks to move from mammals to fish. So moving from mice to zebrafish, for instance, in cases where that's possible, where a zebrafish would be a fine model organism, then, don't use the mice, use the fish. And then we have to ask, okay, well, why on earth would we think that's justified? Why is that a fine way of proceeding? And so, one way of thinking about this, one way of setting this up is to think, oh, well, how many zebrafish exactly, is a mouse worth? What exactly is the trade-off rate between these individuals? And that's a fine way, sort of, as initially coming at this problem. But of course, that's not really the level of granularity that we want to consider when we're confronting questions about interspecies trade-offs, because we get different levels of harm and often different numbers of individuals. And that's what really makes the problem particularly thorny, where we say, oh, well, we want to enucleate these mice. We want to remove the eyes and we want to do research on the eyes, say. And well, that's going to cause a certain amount of harm to some number of mice. And maybe we would, cause slightly less harm, but we'd have to use more zebrafish for whatever reason. You can sort of fill in the details of the case however you want. And now we have this hard question where there's a sort of a tension between the number of individuals and the ostensible amount of harm to any given individual. And one way of proceeding here, one way of sort of making sense of this at a macro level is to say, okay, let's just assume that we can aggregate welfare, and then we'll just see, which involves the greater total amount of welfare lost, and that's going to be the thing that's worse, and that's going to be the thing that we're going to try to avoid. And then as soon as we sort of confront that, we have to figure out some other assumptions that we're going to have to make along the way. We're going to assume, well, okay, how exactly do we compare the welfare of these mice and these zebrafish? I guess we'll have to just assume that there's some common scale, and we'll assume that they start at some point on that scale, and then we can do the math, right? Then we can multiply through and sum, and we can end up with an assessment. We can say, oh, well, look at this particular trade-off, given that the number of individuals, given the amount of harm that we think we would cause, it actually would be worse to switch to the fish, and so we should stick with the mice. That's the kind of, the bit rough framework that we might want to bring to bear, assuming that we're allowed to do this kind of impartial aggregation of welfare, then we can get an answer to our question, what we ought to do in particular trade-off cases. But like, even if you grant that we could do that, right? Even if you're okay with the idea of, doing this impartial aggregation of welfare, we're just left with tons of really hard questions about which there are deep and persistent disagreements, right? So we don't agree about the correct theory of welfare. So should we be hedonists? Should we go in for some sort of perfectionism? Should we be desire satisfaction theorists? Should we have some sort of objective list theory, right? What are the different implications of going in for those views? We might disagree about animals' capacity for welfare, by which we do not mean their capacity to realize any welfare at all, but rather we might wonder, well, is it the case that some animals can realize more welfare than others? And if so, how would we know? Even if we think we can get some handle on that, there are going to be hard questions about how to measure welfare. So, I just breezily said, oh yeah, 50% reduction in the welfare of the mice, 33% reduction in the welfare of the zebrafish. How on earth do we come up with those estimates? What's the basis for those? And then supposing that you do have equal quantities of welfare, when they come from very different kinds of organisms, does it make sense to weight them equally? Do we want to say that the welfare of those zebrafish is the same, as long as we're talking about the same amount of it, right, as the welfare of the mice, as a bonobo, as a black soldier fly, as an octopus, so on and so forth, right? All of these questions are going to come up when we start comparing the welfare across species. Those questions are hard. I'm not going to answer them all today. I'm going to gesture in the direction of some answers, but I want us to be aware of how difficult these problems are, because one of the things that they do, the mere fact that we have these deep disagreements, can lead us to start thinking, well, look, you know, philosophy, who knows how to make progress? Really tough. So maybe given that we actually face these choices and we have to make decisions, we need to come up with some rough and ready proxies, some rough and ready tools that are going to allow us to make decisions across or despite these deep disagreements. And so, you know, somebody might want to use neuron counts for that purpose, right? This has been a surprisingly popular way. Effective altruists have been, you know, talking about this for a while. Will McCaskill, in his new book, What We Owe the Future, does something like this. There's been discussion about it in several other contexts. And the thought is, well, maybe what we should do is, you know, welfare seems to have something to do with brains. Brains are made of neurons. Maybe, you know, the number of neurons is some very crude proxy for the things that we really care about that are welfare relevant. And if we use these numbers, right, which have the great virtue of being readily available, you know, then we could start comparing welfare across species. We know it's imperfect. No one's claiming this is ideal, but it's a way of navigating the problem of deep disagreement and just getting the project going. And so, well, you know, we started off when we were talking earlier and saying, well, what kind of scale should we put these animals on? We'll put them both on a 0 to 1 scale. Well, maybe it should be somewhat different than that. It should be, you know, 0 to 1 for the zebrafish in this case, but 0 to 7.1 for the mouse. And we take our percent reductions from there. So if we can make some progress on some of these other questions about measuring welfare, then maybe we can start looking at something like this as a way of completing the project that we described a bit earlier. Now, this is an attractive option on one level, but it's not uncomplicated. And, you know, one way of seeing that is just to notice that if we go in for this, it's going to commit us to some human-animal trade-off rate, and maybe not a particularly comfortable one for many of us, right? So, you know, Texas State University has a fish farm. We breed fish for experimental purposes at the university, and, you know, a single room might include 10,000 zebrafish. I think a lot of people would be, even, you know, animal-friendly folks might be very uncomfortable with the thought that we're looking at one room of those fish is equivalent to the amount of welfare that a person realizes. But, you know, we're going to have to say something like that. Eventually, we're going to be committed to something like that, whatever position we take here. So maybe we can sort of get past this and say, well, this is a bit uncomfortable, but we knew we were going to have some trade-off rate if we were committed to the impartial aggregation of welfare. So that's just, you know, a bullet to bite. And in any case, these numbers are relatively low. It's also true that, you know, it's not going to work out that those numbers are sort of universally favoring humans. The African elephants are now look to be our new overlords. They are going to have more moral weight. They're going to end up being able to realize more moral value than we can if we just take the neuron count as a decent proxy. So, you know, we rapidly get into uncomfortable territory, but, you know, maybe we can sort of navigate that. We could say, oh, well, we only use them for non-human comparisons, or, well, it's only a rough proxy, so these kinds of failures of the proxy to match our intuitions are livable. But, you know, ultimately, what we're going to have to do if we want to use something like neuron counts to get the project going is we're going to have to answer some hard questions, right? What exactly are we trying to use these as a proxy for? Are we trying to use them as a proxy for something like sentience, which you might think does not come in degrees? It's either you're sentient or you're not. Well, in that case, it's not a very interesting proxy, right? The fact that it's this scalar thing, you've got more or fewer neurons, is not particularly useful. Is it for intelligence? Well, then we're going to ask, well, how important really is intelligence to the value of your welfare? And then, of course, even if you thought that intelligence was morally important, which of course is going to have all kinds of its own really uncomfortable implications, then there's this question of whether neuron counts are a good proxy for it. It's not at all obvious that they are, right? There are many ways in which it looks like it doesn't track, and especially when you look at the incredible abilities of many invertebrates, we realize, quite remarkable achievements without seeming to have that many neurons. So we rapidly find ourselves looking at this ostensible proxy, thinking, oh, maybe this was going to be the way forward, sort of navigating all this disagreement, giving us a rough tool. But then it itself has so many complicated features that we may not find ourselves totally satisfied with it. And ultimately, the question is going to be whether we can do any better, right? And if we can't, well, then maybe we find ways of kind of, fudging the story appropriately so that neuron counts remains as one of the tools in the toolbox. And maybe we want to use it as an input to our larger decision making. But if we can't do better, then we might get stuck with it. And if we can do better, well, then that's its own story. So that's sort of the situation in which we find ourselves. And what I'm going to try to do now is give us kind of a path forward if we sort of pushing beyond neuron counts, but I'm going to give up something that the sort of neuron count folks might have been trying to hold on to, which was very understandable. They were trying to do this in a kind of theory neutral way. And I'm going to say, well, maybe that isn't something we can have. Maybe that's just a little bit too convenient that we can proceed in a theory neutral way. And what I'm going to try to do is make some simplifying assumptions, see what progress we can make given those. And then with those assumptions in place, see what results we get, and then we can sort of back out, look at the product that we've come up with and say, okay, well, how would this fit into our larger decision-making practice? Now, of course, it might just work out that you love these philosophical assumptions, and so you're not going to flinch. You're not going to say, oh, great, I was disposed toward hedonism anyway, and I was disposed not to disvalue certain forms of welfare simply because of who realizes the welfare. In which case, marvelous. But either way, we can either run with the assumptions, or we can simply take them on temporarily and then back out and consider the implications of dropping them. But moving beyond neuron counts, we're going to get some traction here by making some basic assumptions. We're going to say, all right, the goal is to make these interspecies comparisons. To figure out how to make any progress here, the first step is going to be figure out what is our theory of welfare. Let's just take something on. We're going to assume that welfare is determined by hedonic states. And we're also going to assume, this is the Unitarian piece, that we're going to treat equal numbers of units of welfare equally. So we're just bracketing some of those major sources of uncertainty and trying to see how the conversation goes thereafter. And if we go in for this, then we say, okay, we've taken on the assumption of hedonism. And now what we want to do is say, all right, we're treating individuals essentially like, containers of welfare. We're not going to take a certain amount of welfare and say it matters less because it's a zebrafish's versus a mouse. But it still could be the case that there are differences in what we called earlier capacity for welfare, that some individuals, some kinds of individuals, are essentially bigger buckets of welfare than others. That would be getting differences in capacity for welfare. And now the question is going to be, all right, how do we make progress from here? And what I want to do is I want to break down the notion of capacity for welfare so that we can try to make a bit more, get a little more precise about the object of inquiry here. We want to make interspecies welfare comparisons. We're going to assume hedonism. Then we're going to say, well, look, animals could still vary in terms of their capacity for welfare. What does that come down to? Well, it comes down to two things. On the one hand, it's how much welfare they can realize at a time versus how much they can realize over time. And so we want to focus on just that synchronic portion, just the period, the sort of the top of these bars to the bottom of these bars, and ignore the lifespan component, right? Because, lifespan on the whole, we can often bracket in particular decision context, at least if we're thinking about natural lifespan, because, go back to the mouse and the zebrafish, in that experimental context, we're going to kill them at certain times, right? So the lifespan is going to be fixed by decisions that humans make. And we really want to know is, in that period that they're alive, right? What are the possible peaks and the possible valleys? How much welfare could they realize such that we can then say, all right, now we can make comparisons between, how much welfare red is realizing versus how much welfare blue is realizing. And so we're going to focus just on that synchronic portion, the difference between the best welfare state that the individual can realize from the worst welfare state that the individual can realize. That's the welfare range, the difference between the best and worst welfare states, assuming that what we can essentially do is assign numbers to that best and worst, and then simply subtract. So we're now zeroing in on the notion of a welfare range. And if we get that, then we're suddenly in business, right? If it turns out that what we can do is say, all right, we've got a welfare range, right? We know that this particular kind of animal has this welfare range from, say, 10 to negative 10, and this other one is, merely 1 to negative 1, and we can get those percent changes that we were talking about from welfare assessment. Now we can compare, we can convert from one to the other. We can compare animals directly in terms of the amount of welfare they're realizing using welfare ranges plus these sort of species relative welfare impacts, or just these sort of percentage welfare assessments. So we go from hedonism, and we say that's going to be our theory of welfare. We're going to say, okay, but look, there could still be variation in capacity for welfare. Let's focus not on lifespan because that's going to be fixed by the context. We're going to focus on just the synchronic welfare range, difference between best and worst states that the individual can realize. And then we're now going to come to the framework that allows us to actually make progress on interspecies welfare comparisons. If we can do species relative welfare assessments, if we can make those kinds of judgments like, oh, mouse is made 50% worse off, fish 33% worse off, now we can convert. So now we have our whole framework, right? At least in the very abstract, highest level, obviously, not implementable yet, but, in the abstract. I'm not going to say anything else about welfare assessment per se. Very interesting, very hard. Really, Heather Browning is the one doing the most interesting and significant work, I think, on this topic right now. Her work is fantastic and very much worth reading. But ultimately, we will have to be able to complete that portion if we want to be able to use this framework. But the welfare ranges are also going to be a crucial component. So we'll see how far we can get on that particular notion. So how are we going to do it? And I think this is really the major sort of intellectual contribution of the project, is the methodology. So there are lots of things that, sort of may have gone wrong in here, but everyone is going to have to use something like the framework I sketched so far if they want to make interspecies comparisons. So that, I think, is like relatively non-negotiable. But this next piece is, it's a lot less clear whether it's correct, but I'm going to tell you the way I'm thinking about it. We can see what you think. The idea here is, okay, again, started with our assumption of hedonism. We then said, oh, but there could be variation in capacity for welfare. We're just interested in one portion of that, differences in welfare ranges. How are we going to estimate that? And if we're hedonists, what we do is we say, well, what matters, the determinants of welfare, the things that are ultimately important are going to be valence states, right? And the balance of valence states. So what we need to theorize about are the kinds of things that could provide evidence of variation in the ability to realize valence states of different intensities. If states are better for you, valence states are better for you insofar as they're more positively, intensely positive. If they're worse for you insofar as they're more intensely negative, then capacities that might be relevant to, or proxies that might be relevant to the intensity of the valence states that you can realize, those are the things that we're going to want to investigate. And so what we can do then is we can say, all right, how are we going to figure out that? How are we going to figure out where there might be variation? Well, we're going to start by thinking functionally about valence states, right? So there are a bunch of different theories about valence states. Some people think that they're for representing damage to the body. Some people think that they're imperatives that the body essentially, gives to the organism. Some people think of them as a common currency for decision making, right? So there are a handful of different theories. So we identify these particular functions that valence states might have. And then we say, okay, well, if that function were the function of a valence state, what would be a proxy for variation in the ability to perform that function? So if, for instance, the function of valence states is to represent fitness relevant information about the organism, pain states telling you that, you've got some sort of damage, pleasure telling you that, oh, there's things that are valuable for fitness in the area, et cetera, right? Get more of that, et cetera. Well, then you might think, well, okay, representational abilities of various kinds might be some proxy for variation in the ability to realize those functions. And so we can then go into this mode of thinking about, well, what are some specific proxies that might play that role? What are some things like, differences in working memory, or differences in various kinds of conceptual sophistication, or differences in the kinds, the levels of sociality and the kinds of emotional repertoire that's required to engage with others. All of those things could end up being useful proxies. Then you could go out into the literature, you figure out what the literature says about all these organisms, and then you go through the process of scoring these things and saying, well, here's what we found, here are the particular results, here are the ways in which we get various sort of portraits of these potentially welfare relevant capacities that these animals have. And then we can aggregate, right? We can come up with overall scores by assigning numbers to these individual proxies and going through a process of aggregation. Of course, there are lots of uncertainties at every point. So all you can do to navigate those uncertainties is be as comprehensive as possible and allow for people to add their own weights based on their own individual judgment. So, if people disagree about the correct theory of valence, as of course they do, right, then you can try to break out proxies by theories of valence and allow different weighting schemes based on the correct theory of valence. If there's uncertainty about which proxies might be relevant, right, then you can allow for those to be weighted differently so that then when all the scores are aggregated, you end up with different kinds of results. And of course, there are going to be lots of philosophical uncertainties about the significance of these different proxies, even given hedonism, right? Of course, somebody might have a view where higher pleasures have some kind of lexical priority over lower pleasures, right? The classic perspective. And so you're going to want to have different models for aggregating that represent the different ways of developing hedonism so that you can see how all these things ultimately come together to perform or to form a picture of the various welfare ranges of these different kinds of organisms. So we did that. So due to generous funding from Open Philanthropy and others, Rethink Priorities put together a team, an interdisciplinary team, including entomologists, animal welfare scientists, veterinarians, comparative cognition folks, philosophers, etc. And we went out and we did the work of reviewing the literature, trying to figure out what to say about these capacities. We ended up looking at just over 100 different proxies, some of them neurophysiological, lots of them functional traits. And the objective in doing this was to, get ultimately to the scores that are required to do interspecies comparisons as described in the beginning. But even before we get there, let's just flag one of the main upshots of doing this work is just how little we know about welfare relevant traits about the animals in question. So we were interested in 11 farm species, pigs, chickens, carp, salmon, octopuses, shrimp, crabs, crayfish, bees, black soldier flies, and silkworms. So we were focused on farmed animals, right? So we weren't really thinking about, our focus was not on, zebrafish and mice. We were thinking about how to do cause prioritization when you face hard questions. You've only got so many resources. There are untold numbers of animals harmed in contemporary farming. How do we go about deciding which animals to invest resources in? And before we even get to the question of cause prioritization, just from a researcher's perspective, the gaps in our knowledge about these animals is very striking. There is so little that we know, and so much room to expand our knowledge, and especially when it comes to the invertebrates, who now, of course, are being farmed in huge numbers and where the industry is scaling at incredible rates. If we are going to farm these animals, minimally, we should know a bit more about them. Not saying we should, but the point is, it would be awfully good to have some more information about these organisms. When you look at these charts and you see the amount of gray, which represents all the unknown, it's just obvious how far we are from really complete portraits. And so, of course, our confidence about the results of this process should be moderated by the sheer amount of uncertainty. That being said, we did try to come up with specific estimates, and we got something like this, right? These are the these are extracted from larger probability distributions, right? And we end up with these kinds of numbers. These kinds of numbers might seem somewhat radical, right? But when you stand back and think about what they're saying, I think they are a bit less radical than they may seem, right? If you're a hedonist and you think that welfare is determined by valence states, then what we're really doing here is we're trying to estimate, how intense is the pain of a pig compared to the pain of a human, right? How intense is the pain of a chicken compared to the pain of a human, et cetera, right? And it would be somewhat surprising if another mammal, quite closely related to us, with many of the same neurological structures, stunningly similar evolutionary history, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, could barely realize any pain compared to a human. That would be a very striking result, I think. And so these estimates of the intensity of positive and negative valence states and the welfare range that emerges from that, though they might seem rather striking, I think are less striking on reflection. That being said, we don't actually want to place that much weight on the numbers that I just showed you, because of course, we're uncertain about the models. Of course, We know that the results are in partly driven by just how little we know about the organism. We know that there are going to be biases against understudied animals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what we really want to do is stand back and say something like, well, okay, we think that at the macro level, what you should say is something like the vertebrates, they're not going to be below 0.1. It would be really surprising given the neurological similarities, given many of the same functional abilities, given the amount of overlap there is in terms of pain relevant capacities and pleasure relevant capacities, if they were that different, the humans and these other vertebrate animals. And then we think that, look, at this point, what you can establish, the amount of variation you can establish between carp and pigs, pretty small. We didn't see a lot of basis for thinking that, well, the pigs can realize 100 times more pain than a carp. We just couldn't see evidence for anything like that. And so we tend to think, yeah, it's probably a fairly small band at this point that you should postulate for these organisms. Not saying that further research won't change our mind about that. But the point is, at this stage, well, we just want to say, what should you think if you just are deferring to the empirical evidence that's currently available? And then what we want to say is, insects are really hard. They're just huge uncertainties. And what we want to say there is, probably not more than 100x lower than the vertebrate species that we considered are of interest. And if that's right, that's of course a very radical update, because one of the things I pointed out when we were talking about neuron counts is that we're going to get these uncomfortable trade-offs where it looks like some number of animals are going to be realized enough welfare in the aggregate to outweigh a single human individual. And insects are incredibly numerous. And as Jeff Sebo, of course, has pointed out for us, right, we are vulnerable to these repugnant conclusions where it seems like the number of insects is simply going to dominate our calculations. That, of course, may be true. That may be true. If that's true, if we're uncomfortable with that, my inclination is to say, look, the thing to do is not to deny that these organisms have the pain states they have, if in fact they are sentient and can experience pain. We shouldn't pretend that pigs can't suffer, et cetera, et cetera. We shouldn't make various kinds of modifications of that kind to our point of view. We should instead ask about other steps along the way and say, well, okay, maybe this is putting pressure on other parts of our moral framework, and we'll have to think about the way we want to ultimately use this information in decision-making. That being said, I think we can sort of begin to get a rough picture. We can say, like, if you go in for hedonism, there might be still variation in capacity for welfare. We're really going to focus on the synchronic component. We're going to think about difference between the best and worst states organisms can realize. How are we going to figure that out? Well, we're going to start looking at proxies that might be relevant to variation in the ability to realize the determinants of welfare. You're going to have to identify then those proxies. You're going to have to figure out whether the animals have them. You're going to have to score and aggregate them, and then you're going to end up with these estimates. And having completed that process, we can now go back to the thing that we did at the very beginning, and we can start making these direct comparisons. We can say, okay, well, now we've got these welfare ranges. If we can do species relative welfare assessment, as I think we can, though I have not argued for that here, but if we can do that, then we can start doing interspecies welfare comparisons. Now, there are lots and lots of interesting and important complicated questions that remain, but maybe this is a good place for me to stop and say thanks so much for listening, and I'm looking forward to talking through your questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Bob. That was really interesting, and we have plenty of time for discussion now. So there are already some questions in the chat. and I can start reading some of them to you. And just a reminder to everybody that the way that the Q&A will work is that you can enter any questions or comments or objections that you might have in the Q&A tab on Zoom, and then I can present them to Bob and we can hear what he has to say. So we can start with a question from Anand, who asks, do we have to worry about threshold effects? Suppose X has more neurons than Y. Must it always follow that X has morally relevant greater capacity for welfare than Y? And we can broaden the question out to say, instead of neurons, suppose X has more of whatever of the features you were studying than Y. Should we expect that welfare capacity will scale linearly, or should we expect that there will be threshold points where it jumps up a lot? How do you think about that?
Yeah, so this is a really great question, Anand, and I appreciate you raising it. I do think that, so in the neuron count case, focusing on that one for a moment, it's plausible that there are going to be some thresholds where some capacities come online that simply couldn't be realized otherwise. So, you imagine, maybe some number of neurons is required for sentience, and maybe then some other number of neurons is required for, the capacities that underwrite a certain kind of morally relevant sociality. And some other number of neurons is required for the capacity to have, I don't know, perspective thoughts of the appropriate kind that we think, are relevant perhaps to the badness of death for the organisms who have them. In those cases, you would get threshold effects. And so this is coarse-grained, right? It does not distinguish between those kinds of breaking points. There are, in the case of neuron counts, I think this is just like a straightforward problem where it's going to result in not noticing differences that we really do want to notice. In the case of the functional traits, which is what we try to focus on in the project as we constructed it, I think it is a real problem, but not necessarily a devastating problem, because the way you can address it, you look to see if the trait is possessed by the animal, as people who have studied the animal indicate, and then you can simply add weightings for certain kinds of traits, such that there is some significant bump created by possession of a trait that we take to be especially morally relevant, if indeed that's the case. So, like, one of the things that we talked about was exactly this. Okay, many philosophers have speculated that having a concept of death is something that can make death worse for you. If you're the kind of organism who can think about their own mortality and realize that they have a limited amount of time. I'm not saying that view is true. I'm actually not particularly sympathetic to it myself. But if you thought that, then you might want to have that as a proxy, and then say, okay, and you get a special bump if you in fact have that trait. So it's easy to adjust the methodology to account for this, though I acknowledge that it's philosophically fraught, because every single choice that you consider is going to be, you have to deliberate about whether this is another threshold or whether this is a simple scalar property. But great question.
Okay, excellent. There's some more questions flowing in too, and at some point soon, I want to fit in at least one or two of my own if I have a chance. But let's go to Jacob now, who says, do these numbers try to account for the experience of time? I remember seeing something about this from Rethink Priorities, like maybe a mouse or a fly experiences less pain, but experiences life faster, so that 1 clock second for us feels like 10 seconds to them. And before you respond and say that you're only considering synchronic welfare as opposed to diachronic welfare, we can acknowledge that every experience is going to be for some duration, right? So if we decide that we are going to take a 1 minute snapshot of this pig suffering versus this chicken suffering versus this fish suffering, then if it is true that, for example, the fish has a faster cognitive clock speed than the chicken, who has a faster cognitive clock speed than the pig, is that a factor in your estimates about their welfare range during that kind of time slice of experience?
Yes. So thanks for this question, Jacob. It's a very good question. So those numbers do in fact incorporate that. So Jason Shoecraft has done some work, who's now actually at Open Philanthropy. He was previously at Rethink Priorities. He did some reports on the possibility that there is variation in the rate of subjective experience, that some animals experience time faster than others, and some additional work on what might count as a good proxy for variation in the rate of subjective experience, and looked at critical Ficker fusion rates as one such possible proxy. And so he had specific estimates of how likely he thought it was that there was variation, and he was fairly confident that there was variation in the rate of subjective experience. And he was a bit less confident that critical Ficker fusion rates were in fact a good proxy for that. But since we didn't have anything better to use in this particular case, what we decided to do was simply multiply those probabilities that he had assigned, and then use that as an adjustment in the model. So what that meant is that when you sort of look at the distribution, and not just the point estimates that I've shared today, they allow that some animals may actually be able to realize more welfare than humans, because even though their pains may be less intense, they may be realizing more of them per unit of time, which would result in more welfare generation, or in that case, welfare loss, right, per unit of time. So short answer, yes, they do take that into account, though I didn't show you the way that calculation goes in this particular context. If you are interested, that is available actually on the post that I did about this that's currently on the EA forum.
Great, thanks. Okay, I'm going to fit in one of my own questions here, and then we can go back to the questions in the chat. So obviously, as you correctly emphasized repeatedly, this is very much a work in progress, and there are a lot of uncertainties, and there is a lot of bias and ignorance that might be clouding our judgment here. And so we should proceed with caution when it comes to actually making and relying on these estimates. And so I wonder if you have given any thought to at what point we can responsibly make and act on these estimates in the real world. And here I think it seems to depend on what our choice situations are and what our alternatives are in these choice situations.
Yeah, right.
So we can acknowledge that this is deeply imperfect, is probably always going to be deeply imperfect, or at least will be for a very long time. But then depending on what our alternatives are, like if we have to make a choice that involves trade-offs between human and non-human animals of various kinds, and if the only alternatives are doing the best we can by way of making these estimates, or relying on our intuitions, or simply excluding animals from the impact assessments that govern priority setting decisions, then it really seems to be a question about which of these very terrible options is least terrible. So I wonder if you've given any thought about what the actual options are in the short term, and if this option, while terrible, might be in some cases the least terrible option pretty soon in the near future, or if you think for various reasons that we should just keep thinking about this as researchers and not debut it in our decision making for another decade or two or three or four.
Right. Yeah, it's a very good question, Jeff. And of course, what I long to have said about my work is that it's the least terrible option. That's one of my main aspirations in life. So I think to be serious for a minute, I think the general thing to say here is we are not avoiding these choices. We are making them all the time, as you just indicated. So the issue here is not whether we're going to make interspecies welfare comparisons. The issue is how we're going to make them. And then the question is, okay, are we confident enough in some methodology like this to rely on it rather than some alternative? At this point, I think my basic take is that, given the differences in the numbers of the animals in question, that one way of looking at the work that I've done is just, well, it's almost an update toward equality, where you think, look, if you end up saying a chicken can realize is third as much pain as a human, well, to a first approximation, standing back, this is just pushing us much, much closer to an equality view where we say, well, we should treat these organisms much closer to equality, as philosophers have been arguing for a long time, right? And part of me is just inclined to think that's the correct response, is don't worry about the specific numbers, just think about, well, look, what could this process have delivered? It could have delivered, 1 times 10 to the negative 18th, and it did not deliver that. And so that is a reason to think very differently about the non-human animals in our midst. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is, look, actual decision-making is a complicated process, depends on who the stakeholders are, depends on who the deliberators are, depends on the means by which decisions are in fact made, the particular details of the decision-making process. And I think what we probably ought to be doing is having those decisions informed by several models, not just the one that we developed, but by a range of things, people working on a value of a statistical life that's developed using more traditional economic methods, someone who is simply theorizing about these animals using some other approach that's in the vein of the one that we did, but disagrees with ours about particular conclusions, and so on and so forth, and looking at composites that allow us to say, okay, look, given the best state of knowledge, taking the geometric mean of all these estimates is probably the best we can do. And then we just keep updating, we keep revising. And of course, which particular models we incorporate at particular times is going to depend on, who's making them, how comfortable they are, erring on the side of animals versus erring on the side of humans, or erring on the side of particular animals versus other animals. And that is sort of the general way I'm inclined to think about it. So I do think you're right, that, and I appreciate that sort of call for caution. I very much feel that myself. I don't think you should just, plug and chug with these numbers, but I also think, we want to see them as, from the macro perspective, think about what they could have been, think about what sort of larger update that might suggest, and then think about how they could fit into, pluralistic decision-making context where they are one valuable input among many, even now.
Okay, great. We now have questions piling up, so I will try to resist the
Okay,
temptation
I will try
to
to be
ask
shorter.
any more of my own questions too. we can both work at this. So
Right.
this is a question from Bonnie. Should we try to account for indirect effects? So for example, for animals who have social bonds, and bonded animals might suffer vicariously, should that be a factor? Or are you really here only accounting for the intrinsic welfare experiences of the animals, and then allowing that to be one factor in a broader set of deliberations, which might then include these sort of indirect considerations? And Bonnie also instructs me to pet my dog, so I'm doing that right now. Everybody, this is
What a
Snooki.
marvelous person Bonnie is. I appreciate your concern for the non-human animals who are visible in this particular moment. So that's a great question. We are only factoring in direct effects on the individuals. We are not factoring in indirect effects. We did at one point, in collaboration with a colleague of mine, Will McAuliffe, we tried to figure out how you might do that. And that is another enormous project. It would have to be done separately. And so we just decided that, it would be beyond the scope. But I totally agree it's important and worth factoring in.
All right, Nicola asked a question which he then later acknowledged you anticipated towards the end of your presentation, so I can kind of ask an updated general version of it here, which is, how do you, Bob, want to respond to the possibility that insect welfare could, in the aggregate, dominate, or at the very least be a very significant consideration? What is your own personal response to that possibility?
Yeah, so I mean, I should just be very clear. I came into this project, which I was not seeking out. I ended up working on this somewhat by happenstance. But I had done some work on insects before, and I was, pretty skeptical. I was sort of inclined to the "they are little robots" view, and was not inclined to place a great deal of weight on their concerns. And I will say that, spending a lot of time reading about insects, talking to a really fantastic entomologist who has just been such a wonderful resource in helping me learn about the lives of insects, I am much less disinclined to think that any answer that just results in dismissal, blocks aggregation, is on the table. And so, I myself now very much feel the pressure of the possibility that, that insects ought to be a major moral priority, and perhaps a greater moral priority than many of the animals we currently spend resources on. That's not, a particularly comfortable conclusion. It's always awful to discover that the world is worse than you wanted it to be. And if we're now farming, trillions more sentient or potentially sentient beings than we thought we were, that's certainly bad news. But I think my own credence in their sentience and my inclination to think that they're relatively sophisticated creatures, those things have been shifted such that now I think, well, those are just problems we have to deal with. And my inclination is to think that if we're going to make changes, again, it's not in estimates of their welfare ranges, but rather in things like, the degree to which we're going to see ourselves as limited in practice in terms of where we can allocate resources, or providing some space for partiality where, we can still allocate some resources in ways that feel more intuitive to us, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, rather than putting in these sort of like in principle breakpoints.
Great, thank you. I'm now going to ask a question from Chow, which is going to also nicely set up a question that a couple of other people are interested in your answering. So this question is, could welfare proxies exist that are not relevant to humans, and therefore we likely would not know about or think are proxies in themselves? And how could these assessments address or account for that? So what is the decision procedure behind what trait is treated as indicative of welfare? And so, simply put, how can you avoid, or how can you mitigate the risks associated with like anthropocentrism, like starting by saying, okay, what are our brains like, and what are our bodies like? And then to what degree are other organisms relevantly similar to us, where then that is really going to fixate on this particular way of experiencing welfare, even if we assume hedonism about welfare, right? Yeah. Like, does it account for the possibility that there could be other ways of evolving or other ways of realizing the same types of positive and negative experiential states?
Yeah, I really appreciate this question, and I'll be honest that I find it, it's very hard to know. There's nothing satisfying to say in response to this. At this point, I basically have no idea how you do non-species dispersion of this. I would love to tell you that I have some worked out theory and that in fact we controlled for this and it's totally fine. But in fact, it's clearly anchored on our understanding of human welfare. It is possible, as I did say, it's possible to end up with scores that are higher than human scores, or welfare range estimates that are higher than human welfare range estimates because of differences in the rate of subjective experience. But that's really the only factor that works that way. Everything else is set up where you approximate the the human standard. I think we would just have to be a lot further along in neuroscience and our understanding of functional abilities and many other things for us to do this in a way that doesn't simply involve comparisons with humans. But really at every stage that is required, because all of the choices are ultimately anchored in our understanding of these sort of, these crucial components. So, where do the theories of valent states come from? Well, those, yeah, sure, there's, broad, evolutionary theorizing about what valent states are for, but most of the really fine-grained research that you can do on that is going to require being able to get self-reports that you can, of course, can only get from humans. And so sort of at so many crucial junctures, we rely on information about humans to make any of the decisions for the rest of the framework. Yeah, just a problem.
Yeah, I would be very curious if anybody on this call has further thoughts about how welfare comparisons can be made in a less speciesist way. But I can ask a follow-up question, a question that nicely follows up, which both Sean and Jamie ask in different ways, and so I can relay Jamie's version, which is, how might plants or digital minds score under this framework? Can it meaningfully be applied beyond animals? So we've now established that this framework is, in your view, necessarily, unavoidably anthropocentric or speciesist. Nevertheless, you do identify a general enough version of the relevant structures or functions so that you can find variations of them in other animals. So is it possible to zoom out still further and find a yet more general version of these structures or functions that might be identifiable in plants or in artificial beings? Or is there something essential about the fact that we are all animals that makes it impossible to apply your framework beyond that particular biological category?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a really good question. So, I mean, as of Tuesday, February 7th at 5:03 p.m. Eastern, I am inclined to be very pessimistic about this particular thing. Maybe I will change my mind, but let me just, I find myself fluctuating a lot here. So I don't want to commit myself to anything sort of as my sort of stable view, but here's where I'm sort of inclined to come down today, right now. What I want to say at this point is something like, well, it's easiest for me to think about this in the context of sentience research. So, one of the difficulties, of course, of investigating digital minds is that we know sentience emerged from stuff like the stuff I'm made of at some point in evolutionary history, because I'm sentient, or so I believe. And then the question is just sort of, how far back did it go? And what does that tell us about the branches of the evolutionary tree where we're going to find sentience? And maybe it's really, really far back, and all the insects are in. Maybe it's not quite so far back, but that project is straightforward in the sense that, I mean, it's not straightforward in the sense that it's easy to accomplish, but it's straightforward in the sense that we have this anchor point that gets us sentience at some point. And so then we can use functional traits as indicators of sentience, because we can think about, well, what do the critters like us who actually have sentience and use it for things do with it? What traits allow them, what traits are associated with their being sentient and deploying their sentience in various ways to accomplish things in the world? We can go back and find those traits in other organisms. Likewise, right, we can think about welfare assessment in the same sort of way. Like, again, assuming hedonism, we know and we're sentient, we realize welfare, and we think these things are associated with welfare. So certain levels of welfare realization in us. And then it makes sense to go back and look at other non-human animals and think about whether they have the same functional traits that might be tied in the appropriate way to valence. In the case of digital minds, it seems very likely that we're going to get lots of the functional traits without any of those same kinds of straightforward connections. And so we don't have the same evolutionary story that we can tell. We don't have that same common ancestry. So I'm a lot less confident about how we go from functional traits to conclusions about the welfare capacities of these individuals. That's not to say that they're not sentient or that they aren't realizing welfare or that they aren't realizing as much welfare as humans. It's saying that the interspecies case, hard as it is, feels to me relatively straightforward compared to the intersubstrate case. And this is a spot where Jeff's doing work, and of course we're really excited to see where that sort of thing goes, and maybe I'll I'm excited to have conversations with him about the trajectory of that. But that strikes me as a much harder problem. That being said, maybe this is a situation where we're going to end up with very different kinds of tests for sentience that don't go the route of functional traits. And then if that's the case, then we can use those the sort of leverage the sentience that we've postulated to then think about, well, what are these other morally relevant traits? And we can look for functional traits that are associated with those. So I think if we can sort of split apart the project of assessing sentience and welfare ranges and get some other route to sentience, then I feel a lot more confident about being able to do these comparisons. If we can't, then I think it remains really challenging. But of course, lots of people are working on this. And of course, just to be clear, lots of people don't have the view that sentience is necessary for some kind of moral status, right? So there are agential views, et cetera, there are hybrid views. So I don't want to build it all around that. I've just been very focused on hedonic states myself, given the assumptions that have shaped the project that I've been pursuing.
Yeah, it is worth noting, and you emphasized this during your talk, but it is worth sort of reinforcing that you made a bunch of simplifying assumptions just in order to see if this kind of projects can even get off the ground if we make the most convenient possible simplifying assumptions, like hedonism about welfare is true, the only relevant states are pleasure and pain, and then every pleasure counts equally, all else equal, every pain counts equally, all else equal. If we actually wanted to model uncertainty or disagreement about broader questions like what states are significant and how much do they matter and so on, then all of a sudden it explodes in complexity. And so yeah, I appreciate both you're making those assumptions to see what happens and then showing that the project becomes super complex even if you make those simplifying assumptions. But it is worth at the end noting that if you have in any way a more complex view about what constitutes welfare, it gets even more complicated than this, although maybe then it opens up new avenues for example, inter-substrate comparisons. But in any case, with our remaining time, I'd like to ask at least one or two more questions if possible. So we have a good one here from Gary, who says, okay, if I understand welfare ranges to be describing the maximum level of pleasure and pain that an animal is capable of experiencing, which I think is an accurate understanding. So in that case, maybe the worst pain a pig can experience is half as bad as the worst pain a human can experience. But does this difference in range tell us anything about the impact and welfare of a particular harm, which is well within that range? So if I kick a pig and I kick a human equally hard, does the pig experience half as much pain? Does your model imply that? And if I can just add, I think one risk of producing this kind of model and offering it to people is that they might then just assume, okay, so a human harm is going to be twice as bad as a pig harm, and an African elephant harm is going to be 3 times as bad as a human harm. When in reality, a lot of these choice situations might be something like, I am going to, breed and hold captive and dehorn and force feed and mutilate this animal so that I can be relieved of the harm of eating a plant-based meal instead of an animal-based meal, right? And so these are not similar in kind harms. So how can this comparison of ranges then assist us in comparing particular actual experiences?
Right. Okay. So just So I want to separate the point you were making, which is a good one, from the issue that Gary is raising. So one thing that's very clear is that we definitely want to be careful to focus on comparable harms insofar as we can define comparable harms when we're asking the question that Gary's asking. When we're dealing with non-comparable harms, not in the sense of being incommensurable or something, but in the sense that, like, toe stubbing versus horn debutting or something like that. Obviously, it's an open question, which is worse, and my money is always going to be on the mutilation being worse than the minor harm to the human. And I think that's a fairly intuitive result, and it wouldn't be that surprising. But to speak to Gary's question, this is really it's opening a set of issues that I hinted at in the talk, but that we really didn't explore at all, which is how welfare assessment works. So I'm assuming, and this could be a mistaken assumption, but this is the way I think we should frame it, is that what we're doing when we're doing intraspecies, not interspecies, but intraspecies welfare assessment, is that we are effectively just ranking particular kinds of harms relative to one another, or particular kinds of benefits relative to another. So what we're doing is something like developing an ordinal ranking of these things that we're trying to map onto the extremes. So we say, well, look, when slaughter goes badly for a chicken, it's at the worst state it could experience. When it's merely in an ammonia-filled environment with not enough room to flap its wings, it's maybe 2/3 as badly off as it could be, et cetera. And we're constructing something like that. So what I want to say is, when we can take those percentage judgments, use them, multiply them by welfare ranges to convert to a common unit. But then when we focus on something like a particular harm, like when we're thinking about kicking a dog versus kicking a human, we can't compare those directly without thinking at for each set of individuals, for humans and for dogs, like, where does a kick fit in the panoply of harms, right? If it turns out that being kicked in the ribs is one of the worst things that can happen to a dog, or it doesn't actually, that detail doesn't matter. However it ranks, if it ranks comparably for a human, suppose they're both each a 25% reduction in synchronic welfare, then you can just multiply by welfare ranges. If it turns out that it's worse for a dog or worse for the human for whatever reason, due to some cognitive capacities or the absence of those cognitive capacities, well, then again, you're just going to use the percentage and multiply through. So the idea here is welfare assessment is already species relative. It's already set up in a way where the basis for comparison is to other states of the organism and to conspecifics and how they're faring. That's what allows you to generate some kind of ranking. And then you can move from the ranking to these sort of rough percentages to common units via welfare ranges. But of course, all those details are not things I had mentioned before.
Okay, great, thanks. We are about at our end time. So I'm going to ask a quick lightning final question from Shaw, which is, where are the cattle?
Yeah, that's a great question. You're not the first person to ask. Short answer is, we just didn't think they were farmed in sufficiently large numbers, and that our estimates were going to be that different from what we found for pigs. And we were more concerned to get invertebrates in who are less well studied, and we thought they were sort of more decision relevant for people who are considering what to do in advocacy contexts. But we should have done them simply because so many people want to see the results. And so I regret that we did not include them. We, of course, could now do the literature reviews and incorporate them, and that, I think, would be a worthwhile thing to do.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Bob, for giving this talk and for doing this research. I mean, obviously, for all of the reasons that you said in the talk, this research is a work in progress, and our understanding of this issue is extraordinarily limited, and we should all keep that in mind. And even if we can improve our understanding of this issue, it would at that point be one factor among many in our decision making at best, and so on and so forth. But I really appreciate the research, because ultimately we are facing these decisions constantly that necessarily involve trade-offs between humans and other vertebrates and invertebrates. And at the very least, we should figure out whether and to what extent we can make principled, responsible comparisons. And if the answer is no, okay, well, then we need a way of figuring out what to do. But if the answer is at least to some degree yes, then that would be useful information to have. And so I appreciate your willingness to take on this research and share the information with us. So yeah, thanks again. Thank you everybody for tuning in. We are going to have these talks regularly. So if you are interested, again, in conversations about the consciousness, sentience, sapience, moral status, legal status, political status of non-humans, including animals, especially invertebrates and artificial intelligences, then you can go to the Mind, Ethics, and Policy website and sign up for our email list. And as a reminder, we also do now have a talk series for the Wild Animal Welfare Program. You can go sign up on that email list. We have an Animal Law and Policy talk series where you can sign up on the NYU Animal Studies email list for that Animal Law and Policy series. And if you have interest in any of this stuff, feel free to be in touch and we can talk about it. So thanks again to Bob. Thanks to Sophia for organizing and running this event. Thanks to our partners at NYU Bioethics and NYU Animal Studies for co-sponsoring. And I hope everybody has a great rest of the day.
Thanks, folks.